Welcome back to Based on a True Story. This is episode 6, and I am working on rebranding Based on a True Story just slightly because there are so many similar concepts with similar names, if not identical. But once you've secured the RSS feeds and the websites and the Patreons, it's tough to do without starting over. So I'm going with Based on an Almost True Story. How's that for a twist? Because there really are discrepancies that I can't resolve, and this week's story is a perfect example of that, and that's what gave me the idea. The books are based on the opinion of the author, number one, and where government malfeasance is involved, not all the information is going to be available. So we'll see how that takes. Happy New Year to everybody. Thanks to the guys at High Altitude Comedy for the gig at the Block in Silverthorne. That was just an enormous amount of fun. It was great hanging out with Nick Ellis as well, the headliner. I've got not much going on in January. I'm producing a show in the Snowpack's new location in Conifer on January 29 with Mike Stanley headlining, Movita featuring, and Patrick Scott opening up. It's going to be awesome. If you're in the area, come check it out. Again, welcome to episode 6 of Based on an Almost True Story. This week, the movie is Judas and the Black Messiah, which came out in 2021. The books related to this movie are actually twofold. One of them is The Assassination of Fred Hampton, subtitled How the FBI and the Chicago Police Murdered a Black Panther. The author is Jeffrey Haas, who was one of the attorneys on the civil trial that took 14 years to resolve. The other book is called COINTELPRO by Nelson Blackstock, subtitled The FBI's Secret War on Political Freedom. Haas's book came out in 2010. The COINTELPRO book came out for the first edition in 1975, and that was a evolving story throughout the 70s. But that's a great part of American history, uncovering kind of the shenanigans of the FBI, the CIA, the NSA. It involved Watergate, and in this case, trying to undermine anything that was against what the government was doing in the late 60s and early 70s, like the Vietnam War, like oppression of minorities, like people who wanted more equality in the economy and in treatment by the government. So the movie title clues you into what happened in this tragically true story. The quote-unquote Black Messiah in the movie's title is Fred Hampton, and that's a name given to him or someone like him by none other than the character that emerged in our consciousness last week in the episode about Killers of the Flower Moon. It's J. Edgar Hoover. Fred Hampton was chairman of the Illinois Black Panther Party out of Chicago. The Judas in the title is also the very real William or Bill O'Neill, who was an FBI informant acting as a senior member, head of security actually for the Black Panther Party out of Chicago, led by Fred Hampton, who was called the chairman. Fred Hampton is played wonderfully by Daniel Kaluuya. Bill O'Neill is played equally well by Lakeith Stanfield. And Jesse Plemons makes another appearance in an FBI story, back-to-back on this podcast. He plays the FBI agent Roy Mitchell, who manages, in the parlance of spycraft, the informant Bill O'Neill, gives him money, instructions, direction. He's O'Neill's handler, if you will. I felt like not to get ahead, I felt like the movie gave him a little bit more of a conscience than he probably had in real life. Not sure why they did that, but that's for what it's worth if you go back and watch the movie before you read the book or listen to me. So now, what do and what should the books and movies have focused on? They're very different. When Fred was assassinated in 1969, he was only 21 years old. That's not a lot of life history. But that also speaks to the impact he had, that he became such an influential leader in such a short time. So much so, he drew the attention of the FBI generally and J. Edgar Hoover specifically, which was his undoing, unfortunately. The first book by Jeffrey Haas focuses on what Haas knew best, which was his participation in the legal defense of the other parties in the House. I say defense, it was actually a civil trial in the long run where they were the plaintiffs. But there were other people in the House that day. There were two deaths, Fred Hampton and his partner, Mark Clark, that were both killed. Haas worked through what was called the People's Law Office, yes, the PL. In the process, Haas talks a lot about two characters that don't even make it into the movie, but are critical to the conspiracy. One is Chicago's mayor, Richard Daley at the time, and the state's attorney, Ed Hanrahan. In fact, a Supreme Court case that I'll talk about later is called Hampton versus Hanrahan. So they were the ones pushing criminal charges against the survivors of the raid that led to the deaths of Fred Hampton and fellow Panther Mark Clark. There were other injuries. Those were the two deaths. But before we get into the movie, let's set the stage for what's going on in the country at the time, because I think it's important. I think it's one of the things that I'm trying to do to differentiate this podcast from some of the others that just talk about fact versus fiction in the movies. So the raid that led to the assassination of Fred Hampton took place on December 4, 1969. And I'm going to apologize for taking sips of coffee periodically. It's early on a Saturday morning. So go back to August 1955. Emmett Till, who lived in Chicago, and he was visiting family in Mississippi at the age of 14 when he was abducted and lynched. The two suspects in that murder were acquitted by an all-white jury. Those two, Bryant and Millam, admitted to the murder months later. 10 years after that, August 1965, we saw the BOAATS riots in Los Angeles that lasted a week, resulting in 34 deaths, mostly, I think, motivated by anger over the racist practices of LA police, which is why I bring it up, but also grievances over employment discrimination, residential segregation, and poverty in the minority community. Now, sidebar about residential segregation, because I think it's so important and one of the least well understood aspects of the wealth disparity that exists to this day in this country. Residential segregation refers to the many tools of institutional racism, but especially the practice of what was called redlining. Still is. If you go get your mortgage license, okay, or your brokerage license in real estate, you have to understand the history of redlining and the Fair Housing Act of 1968 that made it illegal. But redlining is where the government and mortgage lenders basically color-coded neighborhoods on a map. It's very literal, marking minority communities generally, but black communities specifically, so you could just tell by an address that you should deny that applicant a mortgage and homeowners insurance, creating the racial wealth gap that survives to this day. Those maps were created in the 30s, and there were also restrictive covenants in new home developments. I've read articles recently that uncovered some of these covenants that have never been changed, that basically prevented the sale or resale of a home in a new development to minorities. Redlining, as I insinuated, was outlawed in the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Okay, so Watts riots, 1965. Malcolm X was assassinated the same year. Martin Luther King was assassinated April 4, 1968. As comes up in the story, there's a disagreement amongst the different Black Power groups as whether to be violent or nonviolent and what was going to work. It was argued by many in the Black rights movement that the nonviolent policies, ironically, that worked well in Alabama, let's say, did not work in Chicago. This was a great source of stress and disagreement among the different Black Power groups, violence versus nonviolence. And it's addressed a little bit in the movie. Fred, for what it's worth, was in the nonviolent camp. The Panthers, make no mistake, were armed to the teeth, but legally. They were very smart and careful about that. They weren't actively stupid. They weren't trying to give the police reasons to arrest them and put them in jail for decades, right? Interesting side note, the Black Panthers started showing up at protests legally carrying weapons in California. California passed the Mulford Act, 1967, banning open carry of loaded firearms, which is in the news again to this day. And it passed, no doubt, in response to the Panther Party legally carrying guns. The white government didn't like that. Even the NRA supported the legislation, right? That was an interesting twist in the history of gun rights, that active gun owners and gun rights supporters actually supported restrictions specifically to make it difficult for Black Americans to legally carry firearms. So when this comes up later, the Chicago Black Panthers, they own their guns legally. The one pretext for the raid was that an informant had said there were 2 unregistered weapons in the apartment where Fred was living the morning of the raid. More on that. What else is going on? Vietnam is escalating under LBJ. I think I said already, Martin Luther King was assassinated April 1968. And that was the same year that J. Edgar Hoover came up with something called the Agitator Index. It was like a list of rabble-rousers, civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, black nationalists. The index was used for surveillance, or so was the claim. As we'll see, it was used for much worse than that. You also had, it's interesting, it doesn't come up in the book, which does make some historical comments as the story progresses over more than a decade. But the DNC, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, was August 1968, which invited a huge influx of anti-war protesters. And they were met with, unprecedented police brutality. And that's a theme that carries over into our story about Fred Hampton. Later that year, November 1968, Nixon was elected. And a year after that, in a month, Fred Hampton was killed in December 1969. But so back to the story. And by the way, these two books are done very differently from the movie, kind of like Killers of the Flower Moon. The book in this case is written chronologically from the lawyer's perspective, starting almost with the murder through the court case to its resolution 14 years later. You don't really know about COINTELPRO, about the FBI policy and coordination with Chicago police to do what they did. It's uncovered through the trial, right? Kind of like the book about Killers of the Flower Moon. The movie, in this case, starts with Fred's life, much more of his life, the short life, as a chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panthers. When the movie unfolds, they start with Bill O'Neill, who, spoiler alert, is the informant. We don't know that in the book until disclosure happens throughout the multiple trials. So Bill O'Neill in the story and in the movie is already undercover, basically, with the Illinois chapter of the Black Panthers, and he rises to the rank of chief of security, very much Fred's right-hand man. And he's working for the FBI at this point. The movie does go into, very early on, Bill O'Neill gets arrested for posing as an FBI agent, using a fake badge and everything in order to steal cars. And he gets arrested, and the FBI basically does this deal with him, which is, hey, we're going to want you to be an informant for us and work for us for X number of years, and to get you off of the legal liability if you're stealing cars and impersonating an FBI agent. Okay, so I'm going to try to go through this chronologically instead of jumping around. If you follow the movie plot, Fred was arrested earlier in his life for supposedly stealing ice cream from an ice cream truck and giving it out to kids. So he is in jail and released on appeal. And I'm skipping a lot of stuff in the movie about his relationship with other Black Power groups and their negotiation, and he's trying to get them to work together and stuff like that. I'm just focusing on the assassination and the FBI's involvement with the Chicago police. So what happens is the movie implies that after, Fred's in jail for this ice cream charge that the FBI and the local police went looking for, and he's released on appeal. The movie implies that the FBI pushed for the raid where Fred was assassinated, the timing of it, because he was released on appeal and might get off, and he'd be back at leading the Black Panther Party, and Hoover and the FBI, as we'll get into, specifically didn't want that. They were specifically trying to stop people like Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or Fred Hampton from leading the Black community in their fight for civil rights. The book implies something different. The book implies that Fred was about to go to California to meet with the West Coast Panthers, where he might have been considered for a national role. And he was an eloquent speaker, very motivational. People really looked up to him. He was a great leader. And so the fear at the FBI was that really would have helped the movement, thus becoming, quote, in the title of the movie, a Black Messiah. So either way, whatever the motivation, the FBI agent that is O'Neill's handler, that I referenced earlier, played by Jesse Plemons, is Agent Mitchell. And he goes to O'Neill and says, we need more information on the apartment where Hampton lives. with all his associates in the local chapter of the Panthers. This is in Chicago. Now, it's alleged, although he admitted it later, that O'Neill gives Mitchell a drawing of the layout of the apartment and specifies where Hampton's bedroom is and where the bed is where he'll be sleeping in that bedroom in that apartment. Now, supposedly the FBI and through them the Chicago police are acting on a tip that the Panthers also have 2 illegal guns amongst all the legal guns they own. This may have been a tip from O'Neill. It could have just been fabricated outright by the FBI or just fabricated by O'Neill and given to the FBI. Either way, this is part of the conspiracy that was later confirmed. So I'm going to pause here and point out 2 truths from history that the movie doesn't serve terribly well. And one is, it's the coordination of the FBI with the Chicago police on the assassination. Specifically, and this was denied, or just saying, I don't remember, I don't know, by Mitchell, was giving the layout of the apartment that Mitchell got from O'Neill specifically to local police. It's important to remember that physically, the FBI was not present at the raid, right? So this was very much a coordination between the FBI and local PD. The other issue which precedes this transaction is the existence of something called COINTELPRO. And as you'll learn in the epilogue, no one outside the FBI knew COINTELPRO existed, but there were plenty of speeches by and meetings with Hoover that were included in the movie, despite no one outside the FBI being aware of them, confirming their existence. And through disclosure, and we'll get through those issues at the congressional level, all those documents were unsealed and its existence was confirmed. So COINTELPRO is a syllabic abbreviation for Counterintelligence Program. Not terribly creative, doesn't tell you a lot about what it did, why it existed. It was started back in 1956, and the goal was basically to subvert American political parties that the party in charge generally, or maybe J. Edgar Hoover specifically, didn't like, such as the Black Panther Party, but also Socialist Workers' Party, the SWP, feminist organizations, the anti-war movement, student organizations, environmental organizations, United Farm Workers, the American Indian Movement, and of course the Communist Party. They were all targets of the FBI through this COINTELPRO program. It was all done under the guise of national security. They bribed, they harassed juries and witnesses. They were guilty of wiretapping, especially as it involved MLK. In the case of teachers that were also part of the SWP in their private lives, the FBI sent anonymous letters to school boards making up lies about the teachers just to get them fired, really trying to hurt these people at an economic level. The COINTELPRO book, which isn't great, by the way, but it's full of those stories, and it's got photocopies of memos at a 6-point font I can't read. But if you really want to nerd out on it, that book is there. They used anonymous phone calls, used the IRS to conduct audits. They created false documents. I mean, this was spycraft at the domestic level to hurt anybody that wanted change at the federal level. So as it relates to Fred Hampton's assassination, there was a directive from J. Edgar Hoover sent to FBI field offices, several of them, that stated COINTELPRO's goals against what it labeled as Black nationalist hate groups to include, and this is the quote, to prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the militant Black nationalist movement. Now, Fred Hampton was considered someone that could fill that role, along with King, Elijah Muhammad, and Stokely Carmichael. The movie, if I remember correctly, includes this language in a speech given by the character J. Edgar Hoover to a bunch of FBI agents. The directive's existence is historical fact. The speech itself is not, and that doesn't change the story. It could have happened. Could have been both. So back to the raid. So the FBI has coordinated with local PD, whether you think it's because Fred's out on appeal or he's about to become a national leader after a meeting with the West Coast Panthers. The decision is made at the FBI, this guy's got to go. Chicago police evidently love the idea. So the cops, and the movie gets this consistent with the book, though it's subtle. When you see the raid in the movie, the cops aren't all in uniforms. Not the one that actually busts through the door. They look like mobsters from the 20s, which is weird and relevant to kind of what's going on today, right? They're not. So at 4 a.m., they bang on the door, 4 a.m., and some of the residents wake up, but no one could wake up Fred. And upon an autopsy, he was later found to have, I think it's pronounced seconal, in his blood, but heavy knockout drug and tranquilizer. And conspiracy was always that O'Neill gave it to him somehow. It was never proven. O'Neill never confessed, but its presence in his blood and the fact that he slept through the whole thing is irrefutable. Okay. O'Neill did, by the way, confess to giving Mitchell the floor plan. That is documented. So they bang on the door, open up. I don't know what's said inside. It's 4 o'clock in the morning, but the cops don't wait long. They break down the door. Now, in the lawsuits that followed, the cops in Hanrahan lied through their teeth about fighting through a hail of gunfire. Later analysis of the bullet holes and the shell casings proved that this was simply not true. Meanwhile, the cops shot over 90 rounds into the apartment. By the way, a weird note. When you read the book, the apartment just seemed open to anybody to walk through and check out after the fact, which the lawyers did. And that's how they got half their information. Like they didn't have yellow tape back then? I don't really understand. It seems like the cops weren't too worried about what people could see and learn from the actual crime scene. So cops come in, their bullets are flying, occupants in the apartment are screaming, and they also scream that, hey, there's a pregnant sister back here. That was Fred's girlfriend, who was in the back bedroom sleeping in the same bed as Fred. And after all the other occupants of the apartment were gathered and in the front of the apartment, and Mark Clark at this point was the other death. I think he's likely already dead. 2 cops either enter from the back bedroom or from the front of the apartment to the back bedroom, and they see Fred on the bed, unconscious. Okay, but he's, by all counts, there's no reason he should be dead at this point. What the witnesses said was they heard 2 shots after the cops went back there. And one of the cops can be heard saying he's good and dead now. And for the record, it's uncontroversial that he had 2 bullet holes. He was shot at close range twice in the head. And there are disgusting photos that exist of smiling, uniformed Chicago PD carrying out Hampton's body, cops smiling. One of the family members of the victims described the raid as nothing more than a northern lynching. So after Fred's death, and this is the nature of the book by Haas, is the civil rights suits bought by the survivors, because there were no criminal charges brought against the cops, and no one really understood the level of the FBI involvement at this point. So it's a civil rights suit brought by the survivors and the families, alleging a conspiracy between the FBI and Chicago police to murder Fred, again, because there wasn't a criminal case at this point. And that was thanks to Hanrahan and Mayor Daley. And the civil case went nowhere for years because of an incredibly biased at best and crooked at worst judge assigned to the case, Judge Perry, who ended up dismissing the case. But I'll go through some of his bias right now, because that was really a large part of Jeffrey Haas's book. So let's dip into his bias. So in jury selection, right, he allowed only 6 peremptory challenges, which is fewer than the defendants got. That's where you can dismiss a juror during selection without a stated reason. Perry made a mockery of the process, like asking black jurors if they were members of the KKK and asking white jurors if they were members of the Panthers. There was one juror that was dating a cop, and Perry refused to excuse her for cause. He referred to African Americans as colored people openly during the trial. He did insist on having 1 black juror, and despite the high number of black candidates, and that's all that sat on the jury. Here's a tale about jury instruction. I had a friend and roommate a long time ago whose dad was a very big trial attorney in Boston. And the dad said once that there was no single variable that impacted the outcome of a trial more than the judge's instructions to the jury. And if you've ever sat jury duty, think back to that moment where the judge looks at you, there's no one else in the room, and the judge gives you instructions on how the trial is going to proceed. So here's a snippet of Perry's instructions to the jury once it was selected and before the trial began. and I'm quoting from the book, in describing the incident, Perry referred to December 4th, that's the morning of the raid, as a gun battle, which is exactly what the defendant's position was. He said in his most skeptical tone, the plaintiffs were alleging a national conspiracy to murder Fred Hampton and destroy the Panthers, and that the police did all the shooting, that there was a massive cover-up of the facts by all the defendants. Perry quickly reminded them that these are only allegations. He proceeded to tell the jurors that the defendants vigorously denied all the plaintiffs' claims, and their defense was they were unexpectedly fired on when they sought to lawfully execute a search warrant. That's basically the defendant's opening statement. You know what I mean? And that was Judge Perry's instructions to the jury. Now, the plaintiffs in the civil case were represented by Haas's organization. I mentioned already, I think, the People's Law Office. Yeah, the PLO. Haas, for what it's worth, I think he was like 2 years out of law school when this started, and he struggled to get the law right on behalf of the plaintiffs. I think he was over his head most of the time, but he did dedicate a meaningful chunk of his working life to this case. The PLO did engage one veteran attorney, this guy, Jim Montgomery, with whom I think Haas and his partner Flint had a falling out with at some point. And honestly, I think he admits that Montgomery was kind of tired of their incompetence. And the discrepancy ended up playing out very late in the game, where the lawyers, the plaintiff's attorneys, were doing this on a success fee basis and contingency fee. And Montgomery basically separated himself from the PLO in representing the plaintiffs, almost like second counsel, could have been considered primary counsel, but he was demanding more of the plaintiff's reward upon success at the end of the day. So, for what it's worth. But from the beginning, Montgomery was very good at trying to get the COINTELPRO files released. And that's something that Perry fought tooth and nail. And one of those documents, and they only released a small percentage of the FBI files for years, was referred to as the hit memo. And that was the document that set up COINTELPRO in Chicago. Instructions were to, quote unquote, neutralize black leaders. And that word neutralize is key, as it was interpreted by the plaintiffs as basically a license to kill. But the goal was, quote unquote, to prevent the rise of a messiah who could unite the black movements. Okay. And there was also a memo from J. Edgar Hoover urging the FBI to use local enforcement to harass and disrupt black groups. And there's the conspiracy that kind of gets left out a little bit, other than Mitchell, that this was not just conceptual or casual, that the FBI was working with Chicago PD to do what they did. They were local law enforcement. This is not the only city they probably did it in, but that's the subject of this week's episode. So Mitchell, who's the FBI handler, he denied giving Chicago PD instructions to conduct a raid, which is bullshit, right? And he only said it was possible that they'd seen the map of the layout of the apartment he got from O'Neill. And this is ridiculous. It's a ridiculous claim once all the evidence was in. Like, what did you do with why did you ask O'Neill for a layout of the apartment if you weren't going to give to somebody who was going to conduct a raid? So Montgomery keeps questioning them in a manner that slowly over years reveals the FBI had not given the court all the documents requested in the case. And this is after it's gone to an appeals court and the Supreme Court, and then back to civil court at the end of the day that we'll get to. So because the court case took place for longer than a decade after Fred's murder, I'm going to go back to talk about what's going on in the country during the time of this civil trial. 1970 was Kent State, right? That's where the National Guard shot a bunch of unarmed students that were protesting. The Seventh Circuit Court reversed Judge Perry's decision, finding substantial evidence of conspiracy between the FBI, Hanrahan, and the Chicago police. That was a guy named Judge Swigert. Very impressive ruling. He also found substantial evidence that the FBI obstructed justice by suppressing like 200 volumes, binders, not individual documents, like binders of documents that should have been shared and disclosed upon disclosure of that first trial with the corrupt Judge Perry in charge. One of my favorite senators in American history is a guy named Frank Church of Idaho. And as this was going on around the country, 1975, he convened what became known as the Church Committee, and it investigated abuses by the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, and the IRS. And it was through this committee that the country found out about COINTELPRO, but also, worthy of their own books and movies, Operation Mockingbird, Project Shamrock, Family Jewels, and I don't even know how to say it, Operation MKLUTRA, which involved the drugging of U.S. citizens as part of an experiment on mind control of humans. So there was an appeals ruling that, again, reversed the district court's ruling, ordering a new trial for most of the defendants. And that was, again, Judge Swigert. That was 1979, a decade after the assassination. Swigert did find a conspiracy among federal and state law enforcement to murder Fred Hampton, paving the way for further proceedings and an eventual settlement. Now, the defendants appealed that ruling up to the Supreme Court. And then at the Supreme Court, you had what's known as Hampton versus Hanrahan. It addressed something to do with the court's award of attorney's fees to the plaintiffs, but it didn't really address the merits of the original trial's directed verdict. The directed verdict was where Perry basically dismissed the charges against the defendants, but it at least set up a new trial. According to Haas, the author of this book, the attorney at PLO, Hampton versus Hanrahan remains one of the most famous civil rights decisions ever rendered. It sent the case back to the lower court where this all started. And for the record, at the Supreme Court, there were dissenting judges in this trial, including the infamous Judge Powell of the Powell Memorandum that led to Project 2025 35, 40 years later, and Judge Rehnquist. That name might ring true to some of you older folks, but no shock there. Okay, so the Hampton civil trial went back to the circuit court. It got a new judge, and in 1983, 14 years later, the city, county, and the FBI were found liable for a combined $1.85 million in settlement. But again, this was a civil trial, not criminal. So it was just about the monetary damages. And that sounds like a lot. It was a very small number once distributed amongst all the plaintiffs. And no one ever did jail time for these crimes, which included murder. So, by the way, there was a documentary that came out about Fred Hampton and the assassination in 1971. I've not seen that one. And then another one aired on PBS in January 1990 that included some interviews with O'Neill. It was called Eyes on the Prize 2. And on the night that that documentary came out, which was also Martin Luther King Day, Bill O'Neill, the informant for the FBI and the Black Panther Party in Chicago, committed suicide. That's the end of this episode. It's going to get more interesting in the weeks ahead. We're going to jump into one of my favorite stories of all time, Charlie Wilson's War. And you can't really understand what goes on in the Middle East as it relates to the United States the last 25 years without understanding how it started with our support of Afghanistan against the invaders from Russia. It's almost too crazy to believe. I'm only halfway through the book, but I will talk to you guys in a week. Listen, watch this on YouTube, listen to it on Spotify, or hopefully you show up at Patreon at some point. It's a free app. The podcast is free to listen to. It's always going to be commercial free. Not that anyone's threatening to advertise on this yet, but that's my goal long term, is to get off the streaming services, the big tech monopolies, and control my relationship directly with the listeners and subscribers. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. Have a good weekend.